The mission statement of the CPOAB is advancing constitutional policing and accountability for APD and the Albuquerque community. Item 3, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Do you have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, Ms. Barela, could you please call the roll?
Member Neopro?
Yes.
Thank you. Member French?
Yes.
Member Galloway?
Yes.
Member Dr. Cass?
Yes.
Okay. Member Olivas?
Yes.
And it doesn't look like Nixon's in the room. That motion passed 5-0.
Okay, thank you, Ms.
It looks
Barela.
like, I'm sorry, Eric. It looks like Eric Nixon messaged yes.
Looks like he's having trouble getting in. So Ed, if you could send that one more time to him to convert him to a panelist, we can see if that'll get him in.
So for correction, sorry, Eric, that motion passed 6-0. Will I include him, Tina? Okay. Thank you.
I actually had one question for you, Ms. Borrella, on this. In the original agenda, the one that I'm actually working off of here in front of me, it doesn't have the minutes on here. Did we get that added to the new version?
No, we actually removed the minutes from the agenda.
Okay, very good. So this is correct. Okay, item 4 is public comment. Before we open public comment, I did want to say that we will be, I believe, the intention here is also to have public comment and discussion and accept comments and questions from the public during our main and really only item here at this meeting, the discussion items. So I suppose I would encourage folks to hold their comments on this until then, but that's not required. So I don't believe we got any written public comment on this meeting, if I'm not mistaken.
Eric, no, there was no written comment.
Okay. And Ed, is that the plan here that we'll be taking comments during the item A and B?
Chair Lewis, yes, I think that direct comment on the policies as they're being addressed is, I think, how we wanted to move forward.
Very good. So given there is no written public comment, we will go ahead and close out item 4 and move on to item number 5, discussion and possible action. Item A is use of force policy review, SOPs 2-52 through SOP 2-55. And I'd like to go ahead and recognize Dr. Cass.
Thank you, and good evening to everyone. So as advertised, we're going to review the use of force policies tonight, and then the next item will be to review the discipline policy as well. But in reviewing the use of force policies, the question should be, are these policies, how well are these policies working? And it's not a quantitative question, or it's a quantitative question. It's not a yes/no question. And it doesn't have just a simple answer. And so as it turns out, there's a well-known, number of well-known policy development processes out there, which involve formulating a policy, implementing the policy, practicing the policy, reviewing and evaluating its effectiveness, which means analyzing some data, and then modifying the policy based upon the data that you get. And so this turns out it's the same process essentially as a scientific method, which is that you create a hypothesis, and then you test that and modify it as necessary. And it's the same process we go through every day in terms of making our own decisions. So I'd like to share my screen, and we can look at the visual aids that I have.
Yeah, you should be able to do that, Dr. Cass.
Okay. Okay, so what you should see in your screen is essentially an outline of what is the policy development process, as well as essentially the scientific method for evaluating for identifying a problem, which is the first step, and then writing essentially a policy that you think is going to address that policy or address that problem. And that includes having a purpose for the policy. That's what you want it to accomplish. So you put it into action by, you implement it. You have to train to do that typically. And then you exercise the policy. And when you exercise the policy, you get a result. And you use that result then to feed back in to look at the policy against what you intended it to do with the action that you just measured and the result that you got. And then you modify the policy. So this really depends upon having data available. And I think it's the data that holds the glue. It's the glue that holds the policy together, or holds the policy development process together. So it's a way to measure the policy effectiveness. And I think that's exactly what we're here to do tonight. And so that's the process, at least for creating the for the methods in order to actually review a policy. So in addition to that, APD has written a policy development process, which employs the kinds of techniques that I just mentioned here, but has more steps, more ways to achieve input and go through a review process. And I just like to briefly go through what that policy development process is. So what I have here on the screen is the policy development process that's taken from the latest version of this policy development SOP. Turns out there's more than 200 SOPs that APD has in play, and they're developed according to this and reviewed according to this process. And so typically what happens is the step one is to essentially either review the policy or to create it, and then get it ready, make a determination if it has a mental health component, and this is peculiar to this particular kind of policy development. If it then goes through the mental health review and advisory committee. If it doesn't have a mental health component, then it goes to what's labeled here as step two, which is a policy and procedure review unit meeting. And typically what happens at these meetings is that they're attended by APD representatives who represent various units within APD. The policy is presented by a subject matter expert who owns the policy essentially. And then what's useful about this, or what's happened since the CASA came around, was that the CPOA, the Police Oversight Agency, has a seat and on this in this policy development process. So we typically attend, or a representative of the agency, as well as a representative of the board, typically attends these policy review meetings. When the policy has been reviewed at these meetings, then there's a commentary period, which in this case is shown as 45 days, but it's typically, I believe that it's still subject to approval, but typically it's been something like 15 days. And that is when APD officers are given the policy to make their comments as well. Or public can also comment on that and on this, and there's a form available on the APD website in order to make public comment on this. After the comment, or during the commentary period, there's review by the stakeholders, review by the agency and the department personnel, as I mentioned. If you go down, then there's a rewrite or a incorporation of the comments which are put into the policy, and these comments then are presented with the revised policy and what is called the Policy and Procedures Review Board meeting. At this point, the board decides if this is in sufficiently good shape to advance to a 30-day, another review stage. And during this 30-day review stage, if it's CASA related, it goes off to the DOJ and to the monitor team, and they review it. If it's not CASA related, then the CPOA board has an opportunity to make recommendations as well on this policy. And then those recommendations end up going to the chief, who ultimately reviews the policy. If the CPOA board makes a recommendation to the chief, then the chief is obligated under the CASA to respond to that recommendation. So just a few things I'd mention about policies is there's been a lot of work by both the monitor, by their influence on the process, and there've been some guidelines created, I think, or there have been some suggestions made by the monitor as to how policies should be trainable and clear so that officers can understand them. And the purpose is to get officers to follow the policy with the appropriate tools, and then be held accountable by sanction levels and discipline to be sure that they're following the policy. In order to get the right tools, I mean, there's a whole series of training that occurs or potentially occurs depending on the particular policy, which in the case of use of force policies, as we're considering tonight, there's extensive tier training which has been developed with the monitor team. In addition, there are things like crisis intervention training, the tactical and SWAT training, other weapons training that involves the various non-lethal weapons and lethal weapons that are involved in a response to a given situation. So, and then last but not least, there's also de-escalation training, and I think it's a very important aspect of this. And as you'll see, there's de-escalation is a theme within the policy suite that we're going to talk about. So this gets us to the use of force policies that we're going to look at tonight. And I think it's useful now to sort of divide that into three areas. Let's move on. Here we go. This gets to be a little bit complicated, but I'll try to go through this so that it's somewhat understandable. And we're going to focus on essentially the first part of this tonight, because that's the policies that are on the agenda tonight. But essentially, use of force involves preparation before the use of force, the actual exercise of a use of force during the use of force, and then after a use of force, what you do in terms of investigation and review associated with that use of force. So if we look at this, I think it's useful then to sort of look at the overall review process and how this feeds in, into the use of force policies that we are actually reviewing tonight, because this is where incorporating information from a use of force incident, it goes. What I've done here is I've tried to create a flow chart that shows information with these black arrows, and investigative sort of, the black arrows are data essentially, and these heavy red arrows are the investigative information that is developed. So out of a use of force, there's going to be a number of sources of data that are developed, and they're the Apd reports, which are described in the SOP 256 and 257. There's if in these reports when there's an initial assessment made of a use of force incident, And if that assessment is made that this was a serious use of force or an officer-involved shooting, then the investigation goes through what's called the multi-agency task force. And the multi-agency task force is generally the law enforcement agencies in the area of Bernalillo County, Rio Rancho Police Department, APD Police Department, of course, the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, and the head investigator in this multi-agency task force, which is reviewing whether that a policy, once it's been determined to be a serious use of force or an officer-involved shooting, the lead investigator comes from the agency at which the officer was employed, who is involved in this serious use of force. Excuse me. So if the MATF, the multi-agency task force investigation, determines that there have been criminal activity involved, then that gets passed to the Bernalillo County District Attorney or the appropriate law enforcement agency, and it leaves the realm of APD investigation. So, if it is a regular use of force, a level 2 or a level 3 use of force, and we'll talk about the levels of use of force, then it goes to an IA investigation. And this IA investigation, internal affairs investigation, this is governed by SOP 257. And their investigation then develops both, investigative material, which goes to the Force Review Board, and other data, which I think goes into, hopefully it's not a black hole, but in many cases it seems like that's the case. And it's one of the things that I think needs to be, pointed out and worked on in this process. But I think there's data that's here, and it's up to to improve the process. I think what we need to do is capture that data in order to, feed it back into the policy and into and into modifying the policy so that we improve it. So let me go back. Let me finish out this Force Review Board path. So once an IA investigation has been complete, the Force Review Board meets and they do a further assessment of whether the IA investigation was appropriate or whether the findings were appropriate. They may have different findings. And the Force Review Board then writes a report and essentially publishes that. And I mentioned that the CPOA executive director is present at Force Review Board meetings as a non-voting member and an observer. So let's see. I want to tie up some loose ends here. If an IA investigation, it can result in discipline, and the discipline follows this SOP 346, which is also on the agenda tonight for review. And typically now the discipline is a decision that is made by the newly created post of superintendent. And but of course the chief is also always in the picture here. And I don't mean to limit the chief's role here by this one simple box, but he has responsibilities throughout this process. So anyway, in any case, discipline decisions are made by someone if they're termination of an officer, then they have to be made by either the superintendent or the chief of APD. Let's go back up to the beginning. And if we look at the SOPs that are involved in a use of force incident, there are the 4 that we have here, but there's also a whole array of uses of force, related SOPs, and I have a list of those here, which might impact the use of force depending on what the actual application was. So, I mean, I won't go through the list, but as you can see, it involves everything from what SWAT operations use force, On-body recording devices have mentions of use of force. They're very useful in terms of determining actually, the level of force that was used and they're very elucidating in terms of reviewing a case to determine the responsibility for the actions that occurred. So the policies that we have here, I think the main point is that they are the primary policies that govern the situation, but they're not the only policies in effect. So let's see, I'm trying to decide if there's any other comments I'd like to make about this. I would point out that let's talk about the levels of use of force. There's 3 levels of use of force. And level 1 use of force is any force that is likely to cause only transitory pain, disorientation, and/or discomfort during its application. Level 2 force is a force that causes injury, or could reasonably be expected to cause injury, or results in a complaint of injury, regardless of whether the use of force was intentional or unavoidable. Excuse me. Level 3 force results in or could reasonably result in serious physical injury, hospitalization, or death, regardless of whether the use of force was unintentional or unavoidable. And I might add that also in this level 3 definition, it includes a critical firearm discharge, police service dog bites, certain multiple applications of electronic control weapons, multiple baton strikes, level 2 use of force against a handcuffed individual, and certain uses of the pit maneuver, which is pursuit intervention technique when the pursued car is caused to stop by being moved aside by a maneuver called a pit maneuver. So back to this, if it's a level 2 or level 3 use of force, then IA investigates these uses of force. If it's a level 1 use of force, which are the less serious uses of force without injury, then these are investigated by the line organizations. So I think that is, so one last thing, and that maybe that in terms of where the CPOA board review process is, it's important to us that we have a role in this review of any of these uses of force that come out of the Force Review Board. And this is by the ordinance that created the CPOA and the CASA, which is also defines many of the responsibilities of the CPOA. So I think, let's see, I want to make sure I've covered all the aspects of that. But I think that if there's any questions along the way, we're certainly open to answering these questions. And I think public comment may be the time when that happens best. But in any case, we've invited APD representatives to be present to participate in tonight's meeting to answer questions that the public might have. But in order to keep this process orderly, we're going to ask that the public comment questions be directed to, we haven't quite worked this out yet, but it can either be myself or Board Chair Levis if he chooses to field questions and pass those along. Otherwise, if he'd rather, I can do this as well. And then we'd like to ask that APD be available here to answer the questions. We're not going to ask them to make a presentation, but we would like them, to be here to listen and to you, the public, and then answer your questions as well when that's appropriate. So I've also created a slide for each of the policies that we have. It at least lays out the policy, the purpose, and the policy itself. And so this is the first policy on the list, SOP 252. It's a general use of force policy. I won't read you the purpose of the policy, but if this is a good place to start, I think we can now open this up to public comment. Unless there's some questions first before we have public comment.
We have a raised hand from Peter Simonson. So let me elevate him so that he can be seen and speak. If I can find him here on the list. And then he can let's see, where is he? There we go. So Peter Simonson should be joining us. Go ahead and unmute yourself, sir.
Good evening, members of the commission. Peter Simonson, I'm the executive director with the ACLU of New Mexico. I'm also, our organization is a member of the APD Forward Coalition, and happy to have an opportunity to just offer some thoughts about the general use of force policy. I personally have not had a chance to look at the other policies, so it's just the first one that I'll be able to comment on. I know that we have some other members that may also be offering some comments. I'll just try to be brief. You know, we, APD Forward has been in this process since the very beginning. I think we have reviewed every iteration of this use of force policy since it's been under revision since going back to even 2015, I think. And I always remembered this to be, or thought of this to be, a pretty progressive use of force policy, all things considered and compared to what we see nationally. But one of our members who may speak tonight as well, Robbie Heckman, one of our steering committee members, graciously did the work of actually identifying some other policies, well-drafted policies in departments around the country. And this evening, as I was sort of comparing APD's policy against some of those policies, particularly Camden, New Jersey's policy and Boston's policy, I was struck by how deficient APD's policy is overall. And just to give you a couple of thoughts of some of the things that really stood out to me about APD's general use of force policy versus, for example, Camden's. You know, the APD policy really reads as a list of do's and don'ts rather than as a set of principles that guide the department's approach to use of force and the kind of logic that unites each of the requirements under each of those various principles, so that, you know, so that the policy sort of hangs together as a coherent whole with a set of principles that officers can come to understand. Yep, sorry, go ahead.
My fault, sorry. I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
And so, you know, I would just really strongly encourage the CPOA board to take a look at that Camden policy, and we can provide a copy of it if you'd like, because it's really quite a remarkable document. And the contrast with APD's policy is really striking. I think one of the things that one of our members may also raise is, you know, one place where the difference is really obvious is in the sanctity of life statement at the outset of the policy. You know, frankly, we have in the APD policy a pretty lackluster commitment to protect the sanctity of human life. In fact, I'm not even sure that we use that APD uses that language. But again, if you look at the Camden policy, you know, it sets out in a series of paragraphs actually that the primary purpose of this directive is to ensure officers respect the sanctity of life when making decisions regarding use of force. And then it goes into depth about what that commitment actually means. With the APD policy, you have a single sentence that says sworn personnel shall make every effort to preserve the sanctity of human life in all situations. I won't go into detail. We'll be submitting written comments on some of these issues, but you know, use of force prohibitions, the next section in the APD policy a number of places where we do not recognize prohibitions that are recognized in other policies. For example, prohibitions on using force to resolve a situation more quickly, to punish a person or retaliate against them for past conduct, or based on bias against a person's perceived race or ethnicity, so on and so forth. Also, no prohibition on using flashlights as impact weapons. APD, in its distant past, has a history of having seen incidents, a pattern of incidents of that nature. Use of force procedures. There are also a series of requirements that I think could be really helpful to the policy. While the policy does require that sworn personnel verbally identify themselves and announce their intent to detain or search or so on and so forth, there's not a requirement that that self-identification actually be clear and audible to the person receiving it. We don't see in this policy a continuum of the kinds of resistors that an individual officer might encounter when they consider the use of force. And one of the really great things about the Camden policy is it provides the officer with a continuum of different levels of resistance and the appropriate level of force that can be applied or should be applied in those various circumstances, so that the officer is sort of given this roadmap for saying, well, is this a cooperative person? Is this an active resistor? Is this a person who is actively violent and trying to harm me? And therefore, what are the appropriate use of force responses? The duty to intervene section in the policy, I don't know, and perhaps the CPOA members can tell me whether or not the duty to intervene appears in another part of APD's policy. I just tried to do a quick scan to see if it shows up anywhere else. If this is the only place in this general use of force policy where a duty to intervene is cited, it's a pretty deficient requirement. It just simply says, when feasible, any on-scene officer who observes another officer using force that a reasonable officer would view as out of policy under the circumstances shall, when in a position to do so, safely intercede to stop the officer's actions. Take a look at the Camden policy and you'll see what a truly well-developed duty to intervene policy looks like. And I just might add that recently the policing advisory task force of the National Council on Criminal Justice just came out with a series of 5 priority recommendations that it makes for improving policing and reducing police violence nationally. And one of those 5 is actually a robust duty to intervene, a policy and training program. So it's, in my view, it's really imperative that we see APD implement something of that nature. And then the last thing I'll say, and thank you for giving me so much time to present. The last thing I'll just say is, it really is striking when you compare this policy to other policies around the country, how frequently the requirements on officers are qualified by the statement, when feasible, officers are required to do this, that, or the other thing. That's not something you see repeated so often in other policies. And here it occurs it probably occurs a dozen or more times in this policy. And it almost gives the suggestion that, like, to do these things, to de-escalate, to intervene, to require that to ensure that people get medical assistance if they've been the subject of the victim of use of force, it's almost like you get extra credit if you do these things, but it's not really an expectation. It's like, in the best of all circumstances, try to do these things, but we know that it's not always going to be feasible. And I just think that language really sort of dilutes the impact of the requirements that we're trying to put on officers to ensure that they use force responsibly, to use it proportionately to the circumstances that they find themselves in, and that they make every effort to de-escalate situations. So I'll stop there. And again, thank you for such a extended period of time to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Simonson. Next, we'll go to Elaine Maestas. Go ahead.
Hello, can you all hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So first, I would just like to thank you all for giving us the opportunity to provide our input. My name is Elaine Maestas. I am a police accountability strategist with the ACLU of New Mexico, and I am also a member of the APD Forward Coalition. And I just want to thank Peter. I think he did a great job on highlighting APD Forward's comments and concerns. So APD Forward is actively working right now on a thorough review of these policies, and we plan on submitting our findings to you all as soon as possible. So when reviewing implemented policies across the country, we came across Camden PD's policies, as Peter had stated. And I really want to emphasize that we highly recommend that the CPOA and APD's Policy, Procedure, and Review Subcommittee review Camden PD's policies that have been implemented and followed, and that they recommend changes that reflect Camden PD's policies. These policies have led to great successes in that department that we honestly hope to see happen here. So I'll provide input now on the revised policies that we are reviewing tonight. So there is a reference to the Graham versus Connor in 252 that is unnecessary and interjects potential confusion regarding the standards required by the SOP in APD's policies. So we would just suggest the removal of that reference, especially because there is a paragraph that clearly states that the department requires sworn personnel to exercise a higher duty of care than that that is set forth in Graham. But if this language is to be retained, we strongly suggest that in the paragraph 4 be devoted to explaining why and how APD aspires to a much higher standard, adding its commitments to training and equipping sworn personnel to meet to this higher standard. We also recommend that the city and APD make a clear statement in the use of force policy regarding the city and APD's commitment to the sanctity of human life, transparency, and accountability, and how they will support and train officers accordingly. Again, I just want to thank you all for this opportunity, and we will be getting our written statements over to you as soon as possible.
Thank you, Ms. Maestas. Next, we'll go to Attorney Cronin.
Yes, thank you all. I echo the sentiments of Peter and Elaine. They took some of the wind out of what I was going to say, but in addition to what they have said, I don't see any prohibition on the use of force or a level of use of force on someone who is identified being in a behavioral health crisis, and the process of perhaps calling in other professionals, such as the people associated with the Albuquerque Safety Department, who would be better off dealing with this situation rather than armed officers. So I think there should be a prohibition on using certain levels of force on people in a behavioral health crisis. And I would urge you to consider doing something regarding that.
Thanks, Attorney Cronin. That's all we have as far as anybody who has raised their hand. And there hasn't been anything submitted in the chat.
Director Harness, I think you muted yourself.
Yeah, I did, didn't I? Sorry about that. I'm out of practice. I went on vacation. We don't have any other persons that have raised their hand, and we don't have anything else in the chat. So I think that may conclude our comment on 252, unless there's something else.
Ed, are the panelists allowed to make comment?
Chair Levis, Member Nixon, of course. It's your meeting.
So thank you for your comments, Mr. Cronin, Ms. Maestas, and make sure I get everybody's name here. One of the things that I've felt in looking at the SOPs when I first came on board of the board was that I looked for different phrases such as like protect and serve or something like that. And then in a lot of the SOPs, in fact, I don't recall finding it, that term protect and serve, although it is on the side of the police cars for APD. With what you are saying, and I do have the Camden use of force policy up, with the first part in the paragraph for purpose, it says the primary purpose of the directive is to ensure officers respect the sanctity of life when making decisions regarding use of force. I don't know if you realize some of the cases that have gone down through APD, but what you illustrated in your findings also really brought to light the recent case that we looked at. And I'm not going to go into detail with it, but it seems to me that looking at this policy 252, it is void of the sanctity of life, in my opinion. I don't see anything in there. And if you see how APD officers in some cases handle a suspect that has even been shot after the fact, there is no sanctity of life in that capacity, in that situation. So thank you for bringing that to the attention, because as you can see, the SOPs 52-52 needs a lot of work. And in comparison to what other cities have done, and that paling in comparison, I think that you are generous. This policy, in my opinion, reeks of implicit bias and gives a lot of wiggle room to do a lot of harm to the public. The way it is written, it's written similar to what I would expect a soldier to be written to before they have to go off to war and fight an enemy that's been designated for them. So that's just my opinion on it. But thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to the three of you.
I believe Member French has her hand raised.
Yeah, I have a question for Mr. Simonson. Is he still here? And is he still able to hear us?
Yes, hold on. I have to bring him back. I have to bring him back in as a panelist. So give me a second. Sorry. Go ahead.
Mr. Simonson, you were saying Camden. How do you spell that? Because I want to look at it also. And then my second question to you is something you said. You said you see a lot of do's and don'ts in our SOP or in this, but you don't see principles. Would you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. Can you all hear me okay? Yep, great. Yeah, so for example, and not that you don't want do's and don'ts in a policy of this kind, but the Camden policy, we also looked at the, again, I credit Robbie Heckman for doing the background work on this, but Robbie was also able to find the Boston and the Las Vegas Metro policies, and they have some similar, good, I think, great aspects to them. But, for example, the Camden policy in particular is organized around a set of core principles. So, for example, one principle is officers may use force only to accomplish specific law enforcement objectives. And after that, you have a set of requirements that sort of accomplishes that core principle. The second core principle is whenever feasible, officers should attempt to de-escalate confrontations with the goal of resolving encounters without force. And then after that, you have all these other requirements organized to achieve that principle. And, you know, the APD policy, by contrast, is just sort of organized around a set of do's and don'ts. Without that those kind of organizing principles, I just have to think that if you're an officer, and this would be true, you know, for an operational policy in our own organization, the policy makes a whole lot more sense, and I would imagine is easier to implement and follow if you're guided by trying to accomplish those bigger principles. And you know, it means that the whole policy sort of hangs together naturally, and you sort of have a roadmap for recalling what these various requirements are. Whereas with the APD policy, you just kind of have a list of stuff that you have to memorize. And there's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of which is good, and a lot of which appears in these other policies, but it's just the way that it's organized that I think makes it harder to assimilate. I would imagine it would make it harder to assimilate. You know, I think officers want to know what's the rationale behind these policies, not that they just have a series of requirements imposed upon them, but that there is a guiding logic to each and every one of those sets of requirements.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I just like to point out that there is a mention of sanctity of life in the use of force policy. It's the first line in the policy statement itself, which is that sworn personnel should make every effort to preserve the sanctity of human life in all situations. Whether that's strong enough or not, or whether it's, you know, there's been enough elaboration around that is another question. But there is a statement of that policy. There's also, I'd also like to point out that if you look at the de-escalation policy, there's much more detail in this policy about the process of de-escalation. And so I think, you know, again, this is partly a case of organization, as has been pointed out, but you know, that may become as important as the language itself as to whether it's an understandable policy. The other point I'd like to make is that even with, you know, the proper mentions of these things, ultimately it depends to a great extent on the training and the ability to change the culture in any organization to get the kind of behavior that the policy dictates or is used as guidance for. So while the policy itself, you know, needs work, we also, I think, need to pay attention to what comes after the policy is developed, after the policy is written. How do we actually implement that policy? And that involves training. And then, of course, in the end, it involves, or in the review process, it involves, you know, paying attention to what we learned from the exercise of that policy and using it to improve the policy. And so I think this, in my view, this is one of the deficiencies in the process, is the lack of information which is fed back into the policy to modify the policy or the training that is in the policies in order to to get the kind of policing that the community wants. So I'll turn this back over to other commenters.
I think Mr. Simonson raised his hand again.
I'm not sure if you all can hear me okay. Yeah, I just, I just posted a Camden's policy, so you have a sense of sort of the disparity between the lengths to which Camden goes to demonstrate that there really is a commitment to preserving the sanctity of life versus APD's statement. it's really quite a remarkable difference, I think. That's all I wanted to say.
Yes, and just to direct everyone, Mr. Simonson's comments, the posting is in the Q&A section and not the chat. So if you're looking for that writing, it is in the Q&A section.
Member Galloway and then Member Nixon.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your comments. Dr. Cass, by any chance, because I know you're present at most, if not all, PPRB meetings and policy meetings with APD, do you get a sense that there's an ongoing review of other best practices in the country and other departments that are maybe under consent decrees or revamping their use of force policies just as betterment? Or is this a review of how things are doing in our own community and really kind of goes no further?
I think primarily the focus is on the policy as practiced within APD, and I think it requires a special effort to expand that search outside of the current policy, and I haven't seen that happen to any great extent. So I think you raise a good point, and I think that this is another area that should be that we should try to influence APD to look at these other actions. In a way, I see that as more data that should be brought to bear when it comes to judging or evaluating a policy for its effectiveness. Is how does it compare to other policies and their effectiveness in the practice or application of those policies where they're applied. Now sometimes that's very hard data to come by, but in fact, I think this is the general deficiency of the policy development process is looking at the available data that either exists here at APD or at other police departments. I think the most immediate and useful data is the data that you collect yourself, but I think there is either it's inability to retrieve it, inability to analyze it, or a reluctance to analyze it, so and apply it. So I mean, those are just observations, but I think you've raised a good point.
Member Nixon, I think you were next.
Yeah, I was in comparison to the two policies. I understand what Mr. Simonson was saying. But when you look at the policy from Camden, that's right after the table of contents. The first thing that's glaring in those purposes is the sanctity of life statement that was made, and versus when we look at the first line of the policy, and that's after purpose, it talks about sanctity of life, very, very brief. I wouldn't even call it a paragraph, just a couple of sentences. I think I kind of get it. I don't know that you can train out the hostilities and aggressions for certain people, and I wouldn't even fathom how to screen those out. But I think that if we're looking at it from a perspective of preserving human life, one is one set for combat and the other one is set to preserve human life in a very tense situation. So I just want to say I see your point. Thank you for pointing that out, Mr. Simonson.
Other comments from commenters or participants on 252? We're still going to work through some of these other really commingling policies, so there will be further opportunities. But Okay, Dr. Cass, I don't know if you want to proceed with the next policy 253.
So, I have a sense that, the response should have been to all of these, any of these 4 policies. So I guess I'd like to open it up, make the call again, if anybody has any comment about any of these 4 policies. If there's a particular policy they want to comment about, I can put it on the screen, or I can put the just the summary. But just as a matter of review, and maybe this will stimulate some questions. But as we just saw, we've primarily been talking about the SOP 252, which is the use of force general. And I mean, I haven't put all of the policy statement itself in this summary. There's several more statements regarding essentially the things around the Graham standard, but that's that discussion. So then 253 is simply a policy which defines all of the terminology used in the other policies. So especially the use of force policies. 254 is intermediate weapon systems, and it has to do with identifying the intermediate weapon systems which are used by sworn personnel. I can read this purpose, and establish uniform guidelines for sworn personnel in the use and deployment of those intermediate weapon systems. And so let me continue. Intermediate weapon systems are less lethal options available to sworn personnel when executing lawful objectives that are designed to produce pain and incapacitating effects. Intermediate weapon systems are intended to overcome resistance or stop the threatening actions of an individual to control a situation without causing death or serious physical injury. There is always a risk that an intermediate weapon shall cause an unintended or unforeseen injury or death, even when the weapon is used as intended. Sworn personnel must, there's some verbiage that was changed. I think this is a typo. They shall exercise restraint in the use of intermediate weapon systems, employing de-escalation techniques whenever possible. So this is a policy that, like it says, it deals with the other options, or the options that use non-lethal weapons, which it also points out are maybe lethal if in certain situations. So let me just complete the suite. The fifth one, or the SOP 255, is the use of force de-escalation policy. And I think this is a very important policy that I would hope that we would have some more discussion about. But let me read the purpose. The purpose is to establish guidelines for sworn personnel of APD regarding the use of de-escalation techniques during interactions with individuals in an effort to avoid unnecessarily escalating a situation, to gain voluntary compliance from an uncooperative individual, and to reduce or eliminate the need to use force. When feasible, and this is language, of course, that's it's been raised as somewhat objectionable, but when feasible, an officer shall use de-escalation techniques. Policing at times requires an officer to exercise control of a violent or resistant individual, or an individual experiencing a mental or behavioral health crisis. At other times, policing may require an officer to serve as a mediator between parties or to diffuse a tense situation. So I would also point out, this is another case where, in observing what is in a policy that says that we should, that APD is going to strive to use de-escalation techniques, it's apparent that you need to be taught these techniques, and they need to become second nature in order to be applied. And this, in reviewing some of the use of force cases that we've seen, it's not clear that that's the case. Somewhere there's a breakdown in the process of de-escalation, in my view. And I think it needs to be, you can do this anecdotally, or you can actually analyze a lot of cases and see where de-escalation could have been used and it wasn't, or it was used successfully. And again, this is a case where the data exists within APD, presumably, but seldom in the review of a policy is this kind of data presented to see where it might point out that, yes, there's, we have a de-escalation, statements, we have de-escalation statements in our policy, but we really can't show that we've done anything, successful with this or not. I mean, we can't show the positive cases where this has been in effect, or make the corrections where we could have done a better job of de-escalation, or we were missing a technique. We had the wrong people at the scene. Those kinds of that kind of data exists. But it needs to be dug out of somewhere out of the data that existed at APD, and then applied to the policy. So if that stimulates any comments from our audience or from the board, we'll open the floor back up to comments along those lines.
Looks like Director Harness says Robbie Heckman has a hand raised.
Sorry, let me get him. Let me get him in for talking.
And I also see we have Attorney Cronin also has a hand raised, so we'll get you next.
Yep. Go ahead, Mr. Heckman.
Thank you, Director Harness and board members. Yeah, with regards to de-escalation 255, I think the one thing that it would benefit from is an explicit statement that de-escalation is not just a technique to be used on people who are experiencing a mental health crisis. I think sometimes at APD and in my conversations with officers, they view it as a technique isomorphic or specific to people who are in mental crisis. And I think that, those soft skills that are required to effectively de-escalate would benefit almost any situation. So I think that's one point. I think, and also if I could just back up to the points that were made earlier about the principles and guiding principles of the department. Again, having talked to several officers, field officers, I think in addition to those principles, there needs to be a full-throated statement that APD shares the mutual accountability. 252, as it's written now, is, again, which was mentioned, is kind of a list of what is expected of the officers, and completely silent is APD's full-throated commitment to train the officers, support the officers in and equipping them and building capacity, identifying, of course, disciplinary situations, but also, I think as Dr. Cass is pointing out, remedial training that may be necessary based on it's not all about, discipline. Sometimes there is deficiencies in training that get identified through the practice. So those things, I think that the policy would greatly benefit from those things as well. And I really appreciate you guys having the special meeting and the opportunity. And I apologize, I'm going to have to jump off here, but thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and I'll go ahead and recognize Mr. Cronin.
Yes, thank you all again, and thank Mr. Heckman for his comments. In section H, I appreciate that this is being addressed. I would suggest that the wording "an officer should" be changed to "shall," as used below. And I'm not sure why these other elements of the policy have been taken out. I think they help explain and direct an officer in following the policy. And so maybe somebody could explain to me why the sentence, an officer's approach to an individual can influence whether a situation escalates, resulting in the use of force. An officer shall avoid taking unnecessary actions. An officer shall recognize that the elevated stress levels can have an adverse impact. And when feasible in interaction with individuals, an officer shall use advisements, warnings, etc. So I think those elements are very helpful. I don't understand why they have been taken out.
Mr. Corman, for clarification, which policy are you referring to?
I'm 255.
Okay, all right, thank you. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't make that clear. That is 255-4, I think. H.
Is this the area that you're talking about? Page 5, the middle of page 5 of the policy?
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you. So I can, if you permit, I can read this section and see, let's see. So starting with section H, if an individual is or appears to be in a mental or behavioral health crisis, an officer should attempt to de-escalate and shall otherwise follow SOP response to behavioral health issues. Let me highlight.
Right. So my first comment is that should be changed to shall. And then below that are the sections that have been taken out, and I don't understand why.
Okay, we can note that. And I suspect Commander Evans is also noting the same, so thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think those elements help inform the sworn officers in why they should do this and adhere to H.
I think in reading through this policy earlier, and I don't recall the exact language, but I was actually a little bit confused when it came to applying de-escalation techniques to mental health people or people suffering from a mental health or mental health crisis, whether they were pushing de-escalation techniques or whether they were not, whether this was it was like, well, we have to pay special attention to somebody in a mental health crisis, but it was almost like a warning when I read it at first. I think I had to read it a number of times before I realized that it was intended to apply de-escalation techniques, not be warned that de-escalation, someone in a mental health crisis might not be receptive to de-escalation techniques. I think there's some, and I don't know if this has an impact on the actual, practice of the policy, but I think you made a good point that if officers see this as only applying to mental health situations, and I think mental health, and they're not trained in proper responses to mental health issues, then it becomes not a very useful technique to have, because it may not be employed, or if it is employed, it may not be employed properly. So thank you for that.
I'm wondering if we can recognize someone from APD, if there is someone available that wants to comment on that question. And then I also see that Member Nixon has his hand up after that.
Sure, I'd be glad to, Director, or Chair, sorry. Usually when you see like C, 1, 2, and D, when you see those crossed out, it usually means that there was duplication of effort in our policy. So how this reads to me is that we're to refer to SOP response to behavioral health issues, and there's going to be the guidance that we need for those situations within there. So when you see a removal of something from a certain policy, it's because it was duplicated typically. And should, I mean, it may read different under that policy, under the behavioral health. I haven't pulled it up. I've still been reading the Camden policy. But usually when we use should or when feasible, as Camden does often throughout their policy, I heard someone mention the feasibility statement. Camden utilizes it about as frequently as we do. It's just written probably a little bit better in certain respects. When you see should, it's just if it's not always doable, for lack of a better word. When you see feasible or should, things like that, it's a recognition of it may not be possible to do.
And Commander, just if I could respond regarding duplication, even though these items might be somewhere in another policy, I think it's useful, even if it is duplication of the statements, that they be included in this policy also.
Also, I wanted to mention Robbie Heckman's statement. I did get a lot out of that, how de-escalation shouldn't be utilized as a tool. When I first came on, it was more verbal judo, things like that, how to talk to people. And it was all the time sort of interaction that you had rather than this tool that you utilized. So I liked his statement regarding that. And that's something that I'll definitely take away from this, or one of the many things.
I appreciate that, Commander.
Member Nixon.
Yeah, I was looking through the definitions and the de-escalation policies. I think it's 253 and 255. And I didn't see anywhere in that policy, and maybe this is a recommendation, where you have a definition of de-escalation as well as a definition of escalation. And the reason I say that is because looking at some of the cases I've looked at so far and serving on this board, this policy may as well not even exist. And I'm talking about the way that I've seen officers time after time talk to people who are being stopped, people who are being, it almost gives you the feeling that they're being criminalized, despite the fact that they're not criminals, they're just citizens. And so I understand what Commander Evans is saying, that sometimes it's just not feasible to do certain things, but I also believe that the reinforcement of behavior that's expected of your officers, you should take every opportunity in written statement as well as in action to ensure that those actions help happen. From what I've seen so far, and in living in Albuquerque, I don't see anything in these policies that's going to change, again, is going to change an officer's behavior based on what you see in policy, perhaps with disciplinary actions. But when it comes to that like I said, that implicit bias, those reactions and actions that I've seen time after time that are in my opinion unwarranted. And granted, I haven't walked a mile in their shoes, but just looking at those reactions, it seems that there's a different approach that can be taken, but is not taken. And I wonder if, especially when barking commands, where that lies on the spectrum of escalation versus de-escalation. So that's just one of the things I'm thinking about. I'd like to recommend is that escalation definition be put in as well, so that there's an understanding of and differentiation between the two, escalation and de-escalation. Thank you.
Other comments from panelists or board members or attendees that have comments or questions, since we've now opened this up to the whole policy suite? I see Vice Chair Galloway and then Elaine Maestas.
Thank you, Chair Olivas. And perhaps Dr. Cass, again, because you and I have been through this use of force policy revision previously, I have a very faint recollection of the repetition in policies, the duplications, and crossing policies being put in place to kind of reinforce the message that was being conveyed to officers, what we were wanting our officers to take away, and have it available in multiple places so that they didn't have to cross-reference policies, and there being some value to that. Dr. Cass, I don't know if you remember that as being part of our conversations a few years ago or not, but just to kind of touch on that point, Commander, that there may have been reason for that repetition in there.
Yeah, and I definitely acknowledge that. And I believe there are times where it's appropriate. What I was running into, especially with our force policy, is I think someone mentioned it. It read like a to-do list, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. Our policy needs a lot of work. Dr. Cass said, it does. It needs a lot of work, and we do need to feed the deficiencies and the data back into it to make appropriate changes. What I've run into, being on the department as long as I have, is I remember when the policies were simpler and easy to adhere to, easier to remember. When we get these long drawn out policies, you really don't sometimes know where they're going with it, and they're difficult to remember. So, where do you find that balance is what I'm trying to strike as a, while I'm running the unit, I'm trying to find that balance. I think we can find a policy that improves how our officers interact with the public. I'm already seeing a difference with our officers now. I watched a sergeant who got shot last week rendering aid to the person who shot him. So I'm seeing really positive changes, but like you, I'm also seeing a lot of the bad too, and we're working diligently to address that in policy and outside of policy, with our day-to-day operations. So I do appreciate everything being said tonight, and I've taken copious notes to remind me of it all, and I will be reading Camden's policy as well.
Elaine Maestas.
Excuse me, Chair Levis, if before,
Yes.
while we're on the subject, if I could piggyback on what Member Galloway and Commander Evans said. There has been an effort, I think, on the part of the policy review unit to look for, some of these duplications and try not, and walk that line between having information available and having it be confusing because it isn't quite consistent from policy to policy. And so there is, I think the policy review unit has actually, has done a good job in streamlining the development process, trying to find some of these and actually creating more of a template for some of the policies. So I think, there's an effort, there's lots of efforts being made to do lots of different things at the same time, and sometimes they don't always quite work together. But I think there is, there's some progress out of this chaos. And so anyway, I think this has been a good discussion. I'll stop there. So go ahead. I'm done. Thank you.
Yes, Elaine Maestas.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that we noticed that the word officer was replaced with sworn personnel, and we appreciate that. However, it's left in a particular paragraph. It's in 252, and it's item 6, and it's A7. And it says, and so it's left when feasible, a officer instead of sworn personnel observes another officer using force that is unreasonable, or using force that a reasonable officer would view out of policy. So we would just like, we believe that it's equally important that this statement also includes sworn personnel to be added, not just leaving that as officer, as we would hope that, you know, sworn personnel would also be required to report out of policy use of force.
Thank you. Are there other comments here from board members or panelists, attendees? I wanted to make one brief comment or statement on the balance that Acting Commander Evans spoke about with regards to revising some of these policies and removing some language that may be duplicated in other policies. And I think that we have to be cognizant of that fine line. And I can certainly see where each side of this argument is coming from, but I think that we have to be cognizant that a 20 or 30 page policy that also contains the same language that's contained in another policy that we're asking sworn personnel to utilize creates not only just the physical demands of being up to date with that. And I can tell you that these policies, not necessarily these ones individually, but policies in general, and there are hundreds of them, are being revised constantly. So I think we have to be aware of the fact that that language needs to be used. And so it needs to be in the most usable form, in the most trainable form, in the most easily understandable form. For some of these really, every policy is important, but these are clearly of the most important policies in the department. Certainly that warrants some special consideration for where that line is, what should be removed versus, what's okay to duplicate here because it's important to say. But, it's just a statement that I think, we've got to realize there's a fine line there. And I think that when a policy becomes too large and there's too much duplication, I certainly see where you can make that less usable and actually have the opposite effect perhaps of what you're trying to do. If you're trying to train a policy and get full compliance with the policy, it does seem that something of the more simple nature is going to be the most likely to result in that positive outcome. So I think there's a balance to be struck there, and I'm not sure that this meets that, but I think that's something that has to be recognized. That's my piece on that. Are there other folks wishing to be recognized? I see Attorney Cronin again with a hand raised, if that's current.
Yes, it is. Thank you. And I appreciate the dilemma. I've written policies before, and I understand that dilemma that you guys face. But let me also say that repetition sometimes drives the policy or whatever's being repeated home. It may emphasize the importance of it, and the more you hear it, perhaps the more you understand it and incorporate it into one's understanding of the way things should be followed. So that's just on the other hand. I appreciate the dilemma you guys are looking at, especially you, Commander. So.
Thank you, Mr. Cronin.
Dr. Cass.
Yeah, so I would like to also point out the sort of the training aspect and how do we get training information fed back into the policies. And so when I was preparing this, let me get back to this complicated slide. But if you look down here, there is sort of I've got a box for, this is really the policy modification or the training modification that could occur if we got the data to the right place. And so it turns out that training actually has this SOP 334 creates a training committee, which is composed of several different unit representatives and the intent is to incorporate information that they gather from their actions within a particular unit and bring that to the attention of the training academy, and then incorporate their findings into changes into the training academy. I know that they won't, I've been to one of those meetings. I invited myself and I got accepted. And I know that it seems like a very useful function to have, so that, the policy is, at that point, you can introduce the idea of whether the policy that is written is being followed or not followed because of its ability to be trained, and its understandability. But understandability, ultimately results in how well you can learn it when you're being trained to it. And then, of course, how well you retain that when you actually want to apply it. But I think that there needs to be more formal attention given to incorporating this training information, or results from a policy application into the training, and then seeing whether that needs to result in a policy modification as well. So I think that the policy and the training are almost inseparable at some point. You don't really have a good policy unless it can be trained and used. So I'm making a plug for trying to do a more formal placement of training within policy evaluation.
I just want to say, Dr. Cass, based on our last meeting that I had with you, I've been looking into that, and I think in the future you're going to be happy with some of the results we're coming up with.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I know this is something Member Galloway mentioned at our last board meeting, that she's interested in particular in looking at training. And I think this is an area that, from the standpoint of our board, has not been as visible as, say, the policy development area. And I think because I think it's almost maybe it's hard to say which is more important, but I think they're both important. And I think we ought to, have insight into both of those processes. So thank you. Another comment I'd like to make is that given that, the state we're in, I'd like to point out, we tend to focus on the deficiencies in a process or in a policy, but I think that there's also been a lot of progress in terms of cooperative effort between the community and the board and APD, and actually getting better policies, getting better relationships between APD and the community. And we always say, well, we've got a long ways to go. That's true, but we have come some distance. And I've been on this board for a little bit more than 4 years, and I've seen, 3 different chiefs, a couple different city administrations, a whole lot of other turnover in other areas. And those are, bumps in the road and all, we have made some progress. So.
Looking for any hands raised here, or folks wishing to further participate in the discussion here? Obviously, this isn't the end of the road here. These policies are continuously being reviewed and updated and reiterated through this process that Dr. Cass has outlined, and can often be a confusing process, but I think it's designed that way for a reason. And so, this isn't the end of the road for your participation. If you're looking to participate, the link has been shared to submit written comments to APD on these policies or any policy. So, make sure that you're aware of that. If you have more to add or something comes up later, that was just shared again by Director Harness in the chat as well. So, one last look here if there's anybody that's got further comments on this. Appreciate all the discussion and everyone that's joined in tonight on this suite of policies. Now, we also have another policy, our item B here, that's closely related, but it is a different policy and somewhat of a different nature. So I suppose we'll switch gears a little bit here, and unless there's any last comments on this use of force policy suite, we'll switch gears here to policy 346, the discipline system. And I'll recognize Dr. Cass for introduction.
Thank you. This policy was just published in, I think, in a fairly extensive rewrite, and it was just published at the end of July. And and the purpose of the discipline policy, I'll read that, is to articulate approved disciplinary practices in response to sustained violations of APD SOPs. And it's the policy of the department to ensure that a fair and consistent disciplinary action is taken for sustained policy violations in accordance with the tenets of the progressive discipline that include the nature of the sustained violation, the employee's disciplinary history, and applicable mitigating and aggravating factors. So this is, I'm not quite sure what to say about this policy, other than there has been a number of changes which narrow the definition of misconduct and create a more a better concept for progressive discipline. And then one of the things that was pointed out to me is that this does provide standards for suspensions of officers or for suspensions held in abeyance. And then it explains the aggravating and mitigating circumstances associated with offenses. So one of the interests of the CPOA here is in complaint investigations, and citizen complaint investigations involve at this point that are taken on by the CPOA investigators include some offenses which are defined in the appendix of this discipline policy, and which are essentially minor compared to the conduct, their officer conduct, as opposed to, let's see, what's the other term? Or they're not officer misconduct. They're more procedural sorts of problems. And what CPOA could benefit from in this policy would be to have those procedural problems that show up in citizen complaints be investigated by APD in the normal course of their or remedied, I guess, by APD in the normal part of their own internal discipline system. So I'm trying to think of an example here, but let's see, in 346, I'll show you the list of items that I'm talking about. There's a list of misconduct offenses and a list of performance offenses. And right now, misconduct offenses are the kind of things that can be, fairly serious, and then relate to, and if those occur in a citizen complaint, then there would be there would be an investigation by the citizen complaint or by the investigation team for the CPOA. But if it's a performance situation, such as some of these that are listed here, a driving violation, failure to upload OBRD, improper tagging of evidence, those tend to be performance related more specifically to APD, and they can be resolved, we think, more easily by APD actions rather than citizen complaints. So, or by investigating these as citizen complaints. So this is something that's been proposed along the way, but I would like to open that up for consideration and comment as well. And I see Commander Cottrell is here as well. So if he's a likely candidate for speaking to this issue.
Good evening, Chair and other board members. I can give a quick overview of the changes we made if you guys would like. Like Dr. Cass said, it was a very extensive rewrite of the policy. So if that's what you guys would like, I can do a quick overview of the major changes.
I think that'd be helpful.
I'll help you as much as I can.
As Dr. Cass said, some of the major things is, especially when it came to abeyance, that's been something that's been brought up in the last 3 or 4 IMRs, is the department using abeyance when it's suspending officers. So what I did in this policy is I actually limited the use of abeyance significantly. In the previous policy, there was actually no guidelines set for when abeyance could be used. It can be used at the discretion of the discipline authority. So what I did is I limited it to certain circumstances, and it can only be, they have to serve at least 80% of the original suspension, and they can't have a pattern before, anything like that. So that's actually a big major change in this policy compared to the old one. We did set up the 2 different categories, as Dr. Cass mentioned, for misconduct and for performance. The idea behind that is we explained how progressive discipline was going to be calculated more clearly in this policy compared to the previous one. In the previous policy, there was actually a lot of ambiguity on how progressive discipline was going to be calculated. We more clearly defined that, and we set up those 2 categories to be used as like offenses. For example, if an officer has a previous sustained violation for a misconduct and their current case is a performance case, then that previous case would not be used against them for progressive discipline. And also, as we are looking at cases where there's several sustained violations, as you guys see in the monthly report, there's often cases where there's 3 or 4 sustained violations. So we're actually going to have to go through those now and identify if they're misconduct, performance, how they can relate to each other. So it's very possible for an officer to get 2 written reprimands and a suspension out of a case. So I think what this is going to lead to going down the road is better documentation on an employee's retention card of the policies that they have violated and the discipline they've received. I know we've talked about this monthly about how we're not capturing the right data on our retention cards always, because if there's a 40-hour suspension issued in a case, not every single violation should be treated the same. So we shouldn't break it up as 10 hours for each of the 4 violations. Maybe one is way more egregious than the other. So that's where the suspension came from. So the policy will help us document that much better going down the road, especially in terms of progressive discipline. I also made major changes to the chart of sanctions on this policy, which is the first appendix. That was a big change. There was a lot of leeway in the old policy. For example, if a first sanction 5 on the old policy was a range of 8 to 32, and it didn't give any guidelines on where you could land anywhere in there. So on this, what we actually created is a presumptive discipline for each sanction. And then if you're going to deviate from that presumptive, you will have to explain why you're either going to mitigate or aggravate that discipline. So once again, we're going to see a lot more consistent discipline. Not, hey, this guy got 8 hours suspension for the exact same policy that I violated, but I got 24 hours suspension. So that should go away. We also cleared up in that chart of sanctions the progressive discipline issue when you got past a 3rd offense of the same class sanction. In the old policy, that's all it accounted for was 3. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for a 3rd offense, a sanction 6, sanction 5, and so forth. In this one, we took it all the way out to where an employee would get terminated or dismissed from the department. So it shows that if an officer has a sixth offense, class 6 within a year, then they're going to get terminated. We don't need that officer. Obviously, they're not learning from their mistakes. They failed to comply with department orders. So we're going to dismiss them. So while it does seem a little lighter on the front end, it's actually, as an employee consistently violates policy, it actually is a lot harder on the back end and provides for more guidance when it comes to an employee that consistently violates policy. And those are kind of the major changes. We also explained PDHs in here a little bit better. We took them from 345 and actually put it in here where it kind of fit better with the flow of this policy.
Any place you'd like me to put this policy?
No, I'm good. Any questions?
Looks like Member Nixon.
Thank you. Thanks, Officer Cottrell. Quick question. When it comes to the dismissal or suspension of an officer, according to, let's see if I can bring this up, according to Section F of the 3-46 policy, in the second bullet or the second statement there, it says, upon dismissal from service, sworn personnel shall surrender their badge of office, their take-home vehicle, and all other department property. So when we say all other department property, natural assumption would be their firearm as well?
Oh, absolutely, sir. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And as far as, let me see, when it comes to lateral officers or transfer officers, let's say that they have discipline on their records from their previous employment. Are those, how do you view those? And I know that you may not be able to speak for hiring or anything like that, but if an officer comes in with maybe, and it may not be anything that's considered precluding them from being hired, but it could add to the chart, if you will, of violations when it adds up. How are those taken into consideration if those violations do occur while they're in office? Certain.
So current practice is not to use any previous discipline that they had received at another department. I know this came up at a board meeting a couple of months ago, and I actually looked into this, how we do handle this on the department when we are hiring them. There actually is a national register that we do participate in New Mexico. So when an officer does lose their certification or anything like that, we do post to this national board the officer and the reason they lost their certification. So I did look into that for you. Now, as far as us using, let's say that a state police officer lateraled over, we would not use any discipline they received there for our discipline calculations. I don't know how that would work and if we could get those records from them to do that. I've actually never run into that, so I haven't thought about it, but that's actually something I am going to kind of look into now, because I could see how that it could be an issue if there was a pattern at the previous department and we're starting to see a couple violations here, how that could be an extensive pattern and we need to be aware of it. So actually, that is a good question that I'm going to look into for you.
So generally, if I may use the term, it's kind of like a clean slate when they come through. And that's kind of what you're looking for, because you're trying to get a lateral officer that has that clean record that they can kind of start their process of serving as an APD officer.
Exactly, sir. They come in with a new clean retention card on this department. Absolutely.
Gotcha. And as far as the national registry, if you do find an individual who's on that registry who's looking to be employed at APD, how does that affect their potential to be employed if they're on that registry?
I would hope, like I said, I'm not involved in the hiring process. I would hope if they're coming from another state, especially and their certification has been suspended or revoked in that state, I would hope that we wouldn't hire them. But once again, I have nothing to do with the hiring process.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Other comments or questions from the board or any panelists on this policy, 346 discipline? Not, Member French.
I think you're on mute.
I was, sorry about that. What did you say the website for registry was?
You know, I had it written down and it's in my office, and I will make sure I get that to you guys this week. I thought of that as soon as Member Nixon brought up this question. So I will get you guys the website and the registry name and all that information.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely, ma'am.
Looking for further comments on this, board members, panelists. Not seeing any at this time. So I think that concludes our discussion and possible action section here tonight. I don't believe any action from the board will be taken tonight, but I think this whole session here between these two policies has given the board a lot of information, and it's been an interesting discussion and a very useful discussion, I think, for myself personally, to hear the different perspectives of folks that are involved in this at many different levels. So I think that we want to thank the community and the public for the input that we're getting here tonight, and that we continue to get on other issues and other matters. And I want to remind the community and everyone involved here tonight that the board is always available for these kinds of comments and discussions, whether through the public comment session or through other means. You know, we can discuss how we can have a special meeting, that kind of thing, to discuss policies that are of additional relevance or additional importance that we want to review and spend extra time on. So I just want to remind that's always an option for board members to participate in that, and certainly for the community to be part of that discussion. So thank you everyone tonight for being involved in these, and certainly this won't be the end of this process. It is an iterative process, so this will continue on, and appreciate everyone participating tonight. That'll go ahead and conclude item number 5. Item number 6, other business. Is there any other business that board members wish to raise tonight? Vice Chair Galloway.
Just out of curiosity, when do we as a board need to provide comment back through this process on the use of force policies?
There's at this point let's see, they just have gone through the initial review, so they haven't come to the PPRB yet. And it's after they come to the PPRB that we'll be able to make they enter the 30-day recommendation period. So we don't know when they're scheduled for the PPRB, so we can't quite answer that, but we've got at least a month. So because it hasn't been scheduled. So
Thanks, Dr. Cass. I just was curious how much time we had to do something with the information we learned tonight.
And I think that, you know, these are important enough policies that we should pay attention, and we should, you know, formulate some response. But I think we also we can always do this. And we can always provide some feedback, even if it's not quite on cycle. And that's not a reason not to do it now, but we should have a continuous opportunity to do that.
And I'd just like to suggest, Member Nixon, I've got you on line here. I'd like to suggest on that note, though, Vice Chair Galloway, that's a good point to follow up on this. I think that this is certainly something we can follow up on at our upcoming meeting here in September, to sort of touch base on this. And I'd like to ask that the Policies and Procedures Review Subcommittee also continue to look at this and perhaps begin the process of formulating some draft comments on this for the board to review at large, but also the onus falls on individual board members to submit their comments to the subcommittee so that your comments can be included in there. Please don't just assume that someone else will do it. So, that can come in. Probably the easiest way to do that is an email to Dr. Cass, and that'll get filtered down to the committee where it can be reviewed and edited and condensed into one full comment. Member Nixon.
Thank you, Chair, all of us. I know that I have on my calendar that 1 p.m. tomorrow, there is a Policies and Procedures subcommittee meeting. Is that correct?
I'm on a meeting.
I have that on my calendar.
I think you're probably referring to the APD Policies and Procedures
Oh, okay.
unit.
1 p.m. tomorrow?
I think so. I don't have my calendar up, but I think that next P&P meeting for the board, they have the same acronyms, I guess, is Dr. Cass or?
Yeah, I think it's September 2nd, right?
Okay.
Is the policy meeting, and there is a, let's see, there's a policy meeting at APD tomorrow afternoon. I don't remember whether it's the policy review unit meeting, their policy committee, or whether it's the PPRB. But
okay, thank you.
I just, as a reminder, the initial policy meeting that APD holds is open to the public, except that you almost need to get an invitation so you know when it occurs, and so you can get on by Zoom. But there's no restriction on board members attending that meeting. In the Policy and Procedure Review Board, when a policy is being finalized for the recommendation period, then we have a designated board member and the executive director or his designee who attends those meetings and votes to forward a policy. But in terms of providing public input to a policy in the early stages, it's open to the board, and the only restriction would be in whether we might, or the only concern might be whether we'd have a quorum of board members present. But it's never come to that, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. So if you see a policy in particular that you're interested in, you can attend a policy review meeting of APDs by Zoom.
Thank you.
Yes, Member French.
Dr. Cash, you had said it at the beginning during your presentation that it's usually open. Well, it says that the citizens or anyone has 45 days to make comment, but they have narrowed that down lately to 15 days. Do you think that's adequate for anyone, for us, for the citizens or anyone to make our comments on all these changes?
No, actually,
the 45, what you showed was 45 days, but like I said, it's been 15.
Yeah, if I can respond, it was 15 days, and I believe they're pushing, they're talking about a longer time period for comments. But that isn't the only comment period available. That's the comment period that occurs after the first review meeting. And then there's another recommendation period of 30 days, which also might be lengthened as well. So that's in the works. 15 days is probably not adequate, but I believe, but that was the original. It actually was expanded from 7 days to 15 days. And now I think there's consideration to do a longer period. There's actually some confusion in their new policy rewrite. There were 2 tables in there that showed different periods of time for the comment period. So they're still working that out.
Okay, but I looked at what you presented to us, and that's what I was referring to, but okay.
Yes, and that was lifted from their policy, their current policy that's in front of their review process, or in the midst of the review process.
We're still on the subject here of other business. Is there any other business from board members? Seeing none, I believe we're closing in on adjournment here. Our next regularly scheduled CPOA board meeting will be held on September 9th, 2021 at 5 p.m. One more reminder to get your comments to Dr. Cass or another member of the Policies and Procedures Subcommittee on these policies or any other policy by their meeting on September 2nd. And with that being said, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, I don't know if we had an original.
I'll move to
All right,
motion.
we have
to
a
adjourn.
motion and a second. There we go. Second before the motion. Seeing no discussion, Ms. Barrella, could we please get a roll call vote?
Member Emil-Pruitt,
Yes.
member French,
Yes.
member Galloway,
Yes, ma'am.
member Dr. Cass.
Yes.
Thank you. Member Nixon,
Yes.
member Olivas,
Yes.
member Ralph.
Yes.
Great. That motion passed 7-0. Thank you.
The meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, folks.
Good night.